Video essay selector, please spin the wheel. So anyway, Smile 2.
I keep seeing this face everywhere.
This thing is a parasite. You witnessed a death. Now it's latched onto you.
Smile 2 is a movie I thought was good. Mostly. 2 years ago I made a video complaining about the first Smile while sitting in bed, too faded to notice I was filming myself out of focus. Does that mean Smile 2 doesn't have any of the things that annoyed me about the first Smile? Smile was a movie about a therapist who gradually loses her mind after being visited by a demon who might maybe possibly be a metaphor for childhood trauma.
The reason you feel stuck could actually be more about your mother's suicide.
Do you think maybe this demon is a metaphor for childhood trauma?
That's what gives it power. Trauma.
I think this demon might be a metaphor for childhood trauma.
You can't escape your own mind, Rose.
Now, is the trope of a horror movie where the big scary bad thing represents the main character's trauma or mental illness somewhat overdone in modern stories? Maybe. I don't really care that much about the use of cliche topics in media, depending on how those topics are handled. I recently made a video glazing Squid Game where the scary bad thing is a metaphor for capitalism, the other thing every story needs to be about now. But if you're dealing with a topic, especially a very personal topic for a lot of people, especially in a quite on-the-nose way,
Trauma.
I'd hope you're doing it to say something personal about the topic and not just to profit on a trend to make your story feel more meaningful while actually just being stereotypes for the sake of cheap, lazy shock value.
You're going to die! You're going to die! You're going to die! You're going to die!
When I first watched Smile, it reminded me of when the children of billionaire CEOs decide to make a movie about poverty. I felt like I was watching a movie about mental illness made by people who've only learned about mental illness through cliche horror movies. The movie took itself extremely seriously, but I never really felt like Rose was a serious portrayal of someone suffering from trauma. She's more like a stereotype who jumps from being triggered by a recent tragedy to gifting dead cats to children in the span of like a day. My impression of the inescapable nightmare that is her existence in the film wasn't that the movie really had anything to say about that, but that she was essentially a vehicle for an endless flow of gross out moments and jump scares, a subject to be tortured and ultimately killed for the amusement of an audience.
Holly.
Which is fine. Movies aren't real life. Just don't also pretend your movie is a serious meditation on a real life subject. Mental health is something that's increasingly brought up in popular culture, and mostly that's a good thing, but with that comes a sort of trend wave where corporations see it as another opportunity to boost their brand image by making clumsy, insincere statements about the importance of well-being or self-care, which I guess is easier than actually making your employees' lives easier. And this extends to media. Clumsy, insincere attempts to acknowledge a trending issue for publicity. Have you ever seen when Hollywood tries to talk about autism?
I am a surgeon! I am a surgeon!
In that Squid Game video, I brought up the similar concept of red washing, cynically using the trend of public support for social justice or empowerment to generate brand value, even while the companies and executives themselves actively hurt those causes. Emilia Perez, an Academy Award nominated film that impressively pissed off every single marginalized group it was trying to depict, is an especially embarrassing recent example of what happens when you want to seem aware of current issues without really engaging with any of the groups actually involved with those issues. Man to woman, woman to man, man to woman, penis to vagina. I'm filming this on the night of the Oscars, and I'm assuming it lost everything, but if it didn't, that's really funny. Is Smile the Emilia Perez of movies about trauma? Okay, I'm not going that far, but that's basically how I felt watching it.
And I have carried that guilt for my entire life. I have to let it go.
Did Smile trigger me because it's a horror movie about a dark subject? No, that's what horror movies are. Even in my original video, I spent a lot of time praising several other movies for addressing the same topic in a way I found both more thoughtful and equally horrifying.
So because Stephen Yeun takes from this traumatic experience this wrong lesson, he winds up reliving the same mistakes. Only this time he's not so lucky, because now, rather than drawing attention away from the predator, he's drawing attention directly to it.
In all the ways Smile could have used its premise to comment on the experience of mental illness or trauma, I felt like the film missed the point. Any commentary about the isolation that comes from these experiences felt undercut by the fact that in the actual movie, Rose is a very proactive character, and other characters are constantly throwing themselves at Rose to help her. Her co-worker exists basically just to express concern for Rose every few minutes. Her ex becomes a central character in the story, doing everything he can to help Rose get to the root of her problems. They are then actively punished by the movie for doing so. There are characters like her boyfriend who definitely come off as dismissive, but even her sister only really puts distance between herself and Rose after the dead cat thing, which, I mean, fair. But when you add in the fact that Rose is clearly an extremely well-equipped middle-class person, herself a professional therapist, also seeing a therapist in an active attempt to process her grief, probably in a better environment to break down her issues than 90% of actual people suffering from similar trauma, this made that whole commentary feel pretty weak and fall pretty flat. Where something like Midsommar might use trauma as a way to talk about how we might be taken in by cult ideology, Smile says, actually it doesn't really matter how much help you get or how aware you are of your problems or anything else that might help you. Actually, it doesn't even matter if you do confront your issues. Fuck you. I hesitate to say needlessly cruel because, again, horror movies are often needlessly cruel to their characters. But I guess I'll say this. I didn't find a lot of value in a studio making a movie that is extremely explicitly getting into the topic of confronting personal trauma and then basically concluding with this meme. I use memes to express myself because I'm a relatable YouTuber. I think sometimes maybe I fixate too much on things I'm critical of, but usually I like to at least have shades of enjoyment to the things I cover on this channel. I have in the past actively decided not to make a video about Mr. Bircham. So I didn't initially seek out Smile 2 until a bunch of people, some who liked the first movie and some who disliked it, told me it was actually worth checking out. Now the funny thing is, it's like 80% the same movie.
No! 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 Fuck you! Fuck you!
Smile 2 follows on directly from the first with the story of Sky Riley, a world-famous musician returning to live performance after recovering from a tragic car crash that killed her then boyfriend and left her near dead. Check. After witnessing a suicide, Sky becomes the new host of the Smile Demon who torments her relentlessly as she tries desperately to deal with her problems without destroying her current life. She fails, and then there's jump scares and jump scares and jump scares, and in the end, despite all Sky's attempts to confront her issues,
I will not let this fucking thing use me to hurt anyone else.
she gets reverse vored, and that's the end of the movie. In many ways, this might seem like the same story, and that's because in many ways, it is. There's a lot of familiar plot beats in this movie, up to and including the part where a guy shows up to explain exactly what the Smile Demon is and how it works. I imagine the Smile Demon shuffling notes for bits he can do, and he just keeps landing on dream murder sequences and doing the smile. Points to the Smile Demon for this part, and this part. And I like that the monster is bigger this time. But Sky is not Rose, and this is really where a lot of the difference comes from. Moving past the fairly shallow take on mental illness, Sky is balancing this conflict between the pressures of maintaining a public image and recovery from drug addiction. In a way, it's so clear Sky's trying to move on from a very messy, damaging past. It definitely feels like the story is moving away from the aimless hopelessness of the first movie, where Rose is basically trying to face her demons head on the whole time and just fails anyway. I think Sky comes off as much more actively avoidant and desperate to cover up her problems, which conveniently is represented through physical scars Sky is trying to cover up. Did you get it?
I get up and hug you, but I'm trapped.
So this, I think, is the thing with Smile 2. It's a more didactic story, which is to say, I think it's a story with a lot more intended teachable moments. Fame is kind of like a demon that follows us and forces us to put on a happy face. The desire to be productive, to seem normal, pressures people to hide their issues and avoid confronting them.
Give me a new brain, stuck in a cycle. If I don't stop, I'll end up dead.
I've seen a lot of theories that maybe if Sky had sought out help at the first opportunity earlier in the film, she might have had a chance to actually get rid of the demon. I don't know if that's true. The movie collapses into so many fake out dream sequences that it's hard to make definitive statements about anything that happens, but I understand where that feeling comes from.
You're not in control! I am!
I don't honestly know what Rose could have done to prevent being cooked. I looked it up, and the YouTube channel dedicated to explaining ways to beat horror movie traps literally concludes that her best solution would have been to close her eyes and choose not to be traumatized.
The truth is, Rose should have already been able to see through all of this evil entity's tactics, and if she had considered this revelation, she would have realized that the smartest thing she could do is close her eyes, laugh at the creature, and smile back.
By contrast, Sky is someone you can palpably see make real choices, even choices that are understandable or sympathetic. That doesn't mean she deserves all the terrible things that happen to her, just that it creates a kind of sense to what's happening in the story. Outcomes feel like consequences of specific unfair conditions and not out of nowhere and uncontrollable. It's not the deepest thing ever written, but we can see the commentary about the societal obsession with status and celebrity, the stigmatization of drug addiction.
Are you using again?
What?
The desire to keep going at the cost of our own health, and the decisions we can make that end up harming us more than they help.
I let you all down, and I promise that will never happen again.
Through this feeling of some kind of lesson, there is this sense that the Smile Demon is something that can be confronted, even if the movie ends on what might be its most historic dub. The story ends badly, but there remains the feeling that the story is aiming at a message, some kind of catharsis. And I guess this is the part where I say I liked it more because of this direction. I guess this is the part where I say I liked it more because of this direction. So lately I've been thinking I might be wrong about everything. Something I think can be missed sometimes when we compare movies to their sequels is you're often not quite the same person you were when you first watched the original. I'm not quite the same person I was in January 2023. For one thing, I keep my unfolded laundry out of the fucking shot now, you lazy prick. I'm gonna make a Smile comparison for a few minutes that might help explain this. So there's a part in Smile 2 where Sky goes to her dressing room and the carpet is very clearly a nod to the same design used in Twin Peaks. I'm assuming this was Smile director Parker Finn subliminally asking me to rewatch Twin Peaks. So I did. Since David Lynch's death, I've been thinking more about what it is about his work that's so important to me. Do you ever really like a show or a movie, but when you actually sit down and watch it, you find yourself almost hypnotized by it? That's Twin Peaks for me. And I say that part is largely intended. Twin Peaks is at times more unsettling than most horror media, but part of that comes from the way, in both the original and new series, it plays with the conventions of a generic TV crime drama of its time. That initial soap opera premise, a tragic death in a small town and a big shot detective arriving to uncover it, is something I think was quite easy for viewers at the time to wrap their head around.
One of these people murdered Laura Palmer. It was a mystery that captured the imagination of the whole country. Tonight, the killer will finally be revealed, really.
And despite the gruesome setup, there is this sort of dated campness that hangs over the entire series.
Albert Rosenfeld, I don't like the way you talk smart about Sheriff Truman or anybody. You just shut your mouth!
Part of what I think I love about Twin Peaks is that in lulling you into this comfortable, familiar reality, the moments where that reality breaks down feels way more memorable and intense. This is what I mean about how overdone cliches in themselves are not a terrible thing. Understanding the expectations of the audience is one thing, but knowing and then playing with those expectations is something that can be a lot more powerful. I'd also argue it's pretty much a basic foundation of horror. If you're like 25, maybe compare this to Too Many Cooks. If you're a teenager, I don't know, Poppy Playtime. But before I get too ahead of myself, basically what I realized is Smile is a Twin Peaks movie. Laura Palmer is the victim of a tragic past trauma that ultimately leaves her vulnerable to a demonic entity. This entity sets her on a path of self-destruction, playing with her through hallucination and self-harm until it eventually decides to destroy her completely in a ritualistic sacrifice. Laura, like Rose, has an utterly horrific fate that's effectively unavoidable. The story doesn't shy away from the bleak hopelessness of her death, and I actually like that part of it. A few years ago, Maggie Mae Fish made a really good analysis of Twin Peaks and specifically compared how a daughter's tragic death might have been handled in a more typical 80s era soap opera like Dynasty in contrast to Twin Peaks. In that show, the dad hears about his daughter's death and immediately erupts into a comforting lesson about how this situation actually might not be so bad after all.
This loss, this terrible loss, maybe it'll help bring the rest of the family together.
A few commercial breaks later and things are so neatly wrapped up that you might just forget their child just died. In Twin Peaks, there's no avoiding the fact that Laura's death deeply scars everyone close to her, most of all her parents, who remain barely coherent, hollow people, right up to the point the dad reverts back to the traditional soap opera caricature, specifically as a performance.
I'm back! Lynch will often take a character, put them in recognizable, even cliched TV circumstances, but have them react in an emotionally honest way, as if real humans were trapped inside the show Twin Peaks.
There's clearly a place for stories that embrace the reality of total powerlessness that often comes with trauma. I'm obviously not saying family members who've suffered an immense loss have to act one way or another. People react to personal tragedy in different ways. But the fact is, there are a lot of Sarah Palmers in the world. People who don't come out of situations like this with a neat little lesson and a new lease on life. People are sometimes faced with unimaginable loss and are unable to break out of that despair. It's not nice, but it is a reality. And I think Frost and Lynch recognize something, especially in the way media often trims realities like these out of their stories. It's scary to think that we might lose something for reasons outside of our control and be unable to get it or ourselves back. It's also scary to think that because this upsets people, we might have our whole experience erased out of view, replaced by simple lessons to comfort people who don't really want to deal with what we're going through. Not all stories need a constructive lesson. Not all parts of life have them. Fuck Big Joel, am I right? YouTuber Big Joel actually made a direct response to my Smile video not long after it came out, stating a lot of similar points about Smile.
Jack Saint, please don't watch this because I'm about to absolutely wreck you about Smile.
I will not accept his criticism with grace. He's an asshole and a monster, and he knows what he did when he told me to get a Sicilian slice when it was clearly the inferior pizza. I maintain that Smile doesn't do a good job whatsoever at conveying a lesson about the stigmatization of mental illness or isolation. I just don't practically think the movie's story is laid out in a way that makes that theme work. Especially when it's actually pretty easy to imagine ways certain plot elements could have been removed that would have made that a much more straightforward point. There's also this idea that maybe it's the way people keep relating Rose's struggles to her past trauma that's the problem. But I mean, the thing feeds on trauma, that's just what it is. But Big Joel did do something very smart. He made a comparison to 9 Inch Nails.
I think showing that feeling in all of its destructive awfulness can be valuable. When I listen to the song Hurt by 9 Inch Nails, I'm not thinking, how do we get out of this feeling? What helpful wisdom does this song impart? Instead, I enjoy the way the song wallows in the depths of its emotions, and I don't see why Smile has to be any different.
And because 9 Inch Nails was also in an episode of Twin Peaks, I've been listening to a lot of 9 Inch Nails lately. In music, it's actually quite easy to find examples of art that has no intention of giving audiences something constructive. 9 Inch Nails makes the kind of music that makes you say, this song makes me feel like I'm peeking over the edge of a bottomless hole, and these are the sounds emanating from a void black abysmal hell. Fuck yeah. And the more I thought about it in the years since my last video, the more I kept thinking about how I actually like seeing utter hopelessness depicted in media. The fake-out ending of The Descent It was great. As in Twin Peaks, it's something honest and real that works as a contrast to how these things can often be presented. Not necessarily good because within them is a good lesson. If I was personally talking to someone struggling with a crisis, I probably wouldn't want to say to them that maybe they're just in a hopeless pit of despair from which there is no escape. But a story isn't just a lesson, it can also just be an experience. Sometimes the catharsis isn't in giving you a way out, but seeing a reflection of a feeling. In this way, I started to see Smile in a different light. The way the movie actively sabotages any attempt at a simple lesson about awareness of people suffering mentally. The way the film leads to a message about how we can confront and overcome our trauma and then literally sets it on fire. It's pretty hardcore, actually. Yes, Rose is a comfortable middle-class professional with easy access to mental health services most people would not have. Yes, she has supportive people around her constantly trying to help, and yes, those people suffer terrible fates for it. Yes, she is desperate to face her issues head-on, and in the end, no matter what she does, she loses anyway. It turns out there is no class or treatment or support that will ever guarantee we can escape our fate. Whether or not it's a nice lesson, it's a feeling people can relate to. Even if it's a feeling that sucks. Let's say, hypothetically, you're a recent immigrant who's just barely found yourself in a position to have a stable career. You finally have more than a negative bank balance, and yet for some reason, a little hollowness starts to build inside you, and you're not really sure why. And the world shuts down, and you can't go outside anymore, and really just makes these feelings of confusion and disassociation 100 times worse. You actually start to hate yourself a bit for even feeling this way because you have the resources you need and you can get the support if you want it, but that thing inside you keeps growing anyway. In the end, that thing is actively destroying everything you worked really hard to build. And months pass, and the days and the nights blend together, and still you know there's no reason it has to be this way, and you try to break out of it, and it happens anyway. In the end, you can't even make the effort to remove the unfolded laundry from the shot before you film a YouTube video about how annoyed you are by a movie about how sometimes mental illness is inexplicable and inescapable. Do you think a depressed person could make this?
You think this is true about him? Do you think that he is wearing the mask?
He is wearing the mask.
That's crazy, but not anymore. That's so cool.
I'm glad that he's overcome it, really.
While writing this, I was listening to an interview between Willem Dafoe and Louis Theroux talking about their philosophies on art, and they actually got on the subject of David Lynch specifically. And in that interview, Willem Dafoe said this.
And even that idea of stories hide the truth, I have a little difficulty understanding.
Why not? Because people hop on the train and then they go only to what they recognize. And the truth is something that's hidden, usually, because all our habits, all our politeness, all that niceness that you're talking about often hide certain social conventions, hide what's going on. I kind of get repelled at the idea of, you do a theater piece and you tell the audience something, It's like you're superior, you have a superior understanding, or you've created a situation where you can tell something they haven't thought of. That's not usually the case.
I fuck with this viewpoint. It's effectively in line with what Maggie Mae Fish pointed out in the comparison between Twin Peaks and Dynasty. The wise sage father explaining to the audience that there's a nice silver lining behind this horrible thing that happened. Sometimes I do have a preference for a didactic story. I can find it kind of exhausting when it seems like an author has no interest in actually using their work to say anything, or wants to hide any possible statement behind layers on layers of artistic pretension. So sometimes it does feel a bit like maybe people might need a message to be a bit more direct. Everything Everywhere All at Once is a movie that entirely wears its hopeful absurdism on its sleeve, and I love that movie. And I know there's a lot of people who violently hate it, and it makes me sad that they're already scrolling to the comments section to let me know they hate it, and they hate me for liking it. Because I also get that. A lot of people told me they had a similar experience watching The Secret Life of Walter Mitty, and I found that movie a little bit annoying. I recently watched Night Bitch, and I would have liked that movie significantly more if it didn't feel the need to stop every 5 seconds to remind me what the message of the movie was. To be honest, sometimes you just want a movie to shut the fuck up and let you have a genuine experience on your own terms. I accept that if that's the case, you're probably not the usual audience for a YouTube channel about interpreting the messages of media, and I'm sorry about that. I watched Everything Everywhere All at Once and Smile at similar times, and I think the reaction I had to each of them was very much influenced by what was currently going on with me personally. I was in the process of pulling myself out of what was, at that point, a years-long depression, and something like Smile felt like it was pushing me straight back down. My mental state can go up and down a lot, and I often have this reaction when I'm in a good place and get confronted with art that projects a feeling of hopelessness and despair. I'm also not an authority on valid ways to process your feelings. It's not my responsibility to demand a silver lining when that isn't what you want at that time. With hindsight, I recognize a bias in the way I thought about Smile. And this isn't about what I think Parker Finn or anyone else believed about what the movie was supposed to say. If you want, you can absolutely read it as just another mental illness metaphor horror movie that has absolutely nothing novel or interesting to say about mental illness. In other words, a movie trying to be didactic and failing, falling exactly in line with what I was complaining about. Movies that want to make a big important statement about trauma, but only really care about presenting the image of having a statement about trauma when what it actually amounts to is a cliche stereotype. In my mind, it's a spotlight on that cliche. In the way Twin Peaks used the skin of a generic soap opera to expose parts of society that are often brushed aside, Smile uses the skin of a generic modern horror movie about overcoming your trauma monster to remind us that sometimes that doesn't happen. We can all fall in that pit and have all the help and good intentions in the world, and sometimes it isn't enough to get us out. That's it. That's enough. People can like or dislike a story, but it's nobody's place to say it's wrong if that's what you wanted out of it. I feel terrible when I read comments on that old video that think I'm implying it's wrong to ever feel hopeless in your own situation. I was uncomfortable because I also felt hopeless, and I didn't want to feel that way anymore. I let what I wanted out of it overshadow what other people could have, and I'm sorry for that. Smile is a movie in part about being constantly urged to give a happy presentation. And I guess, in the end, I was the weird Marilyn Manson guy. Now, as a funny side note, I do still like Smile 2 more. Incidentally, both Big Joel and Maggie Mayfish can be found over on Nebula. This brings me to my next subject, ground news. Being able to reflect and look at stories in a new light is important with movies, but it's also important with all aspects of life. I've been reflecting a lot on the fact that while making this video, a wartime president went to what was supposed to be a peace talk and then was interrogated on why he wasn't wearing a suit by Gil from The Simpsons. Ground News is a website and app created by a former NASA engineer that gathers news across countries and political perspectives to provide a visual breakdown for bias, reliability, and ownership. Checking out Ground News' coverage of that meeting, we can see a range of sources demonstrating a huge divide in public opinion between political groups. While most stories are evenly covered on all sides, you can see, for instance, that 76% of stories suggesting Zelensky stepped down as Ukraine's president come from right-wing sources, often with mixed factuality. The Hill highlights widespread sentiment that the meeting was an absolute utter disaster, while the Daily Wire focuses on a Republican senator never being more proud of their president. They even have a whole feed dedicated to coverage bias called Blind Spot, which shows you important stories that some media outlets ignore. I think it can really help us understand how different versions of reality are created based on the information people are exposed to. And if you check out my link in the description at ground.news/saints or scan the QR code on screen, you can get 40% off on a Ground News Vantage subscription. Thank you to Ground News for sponsoring this video, and thank you. As I've already said, Smile 2 to me feels absolutely like it's walking back some of the bleakness of the first movie. And I don't mean that in the sense that less bad things happen. In fact, more bad things happen, and the movie ends with the most bad thing that could possibly happen in one of these movies happening. But what it also has is answers. In its commentary on fame and performance, it's much easier to see where Sky Riley's problems lie and what could have been done to avoid them. Almost everything summoned up by the Smile Demon is an obvious manifestation of what Sky wishes she wasn't tied to. An audience that wants everything from her but doesn't want to see the bad parts, demands and expectations, and a constant anxiety about meeting them. Now, to be frank, there have been a lot of stories about how being famous is bad actually, and celebrities also have mental illness. Even if it's a more coherent story, that coherence doesn't mean the things it's saying are any more thoughtful or complex. If anything, it's the incoherence of the first Smile movie that makes it a more interesting film. I like Smile 2 more because I found it more entertaining. The jump scares, while still present, are more inventive and paced out. There is genuine tension that I found basically absent for a lot of the original movie. It has a lot of memorable sequences and visuals and performances, and that results in a package that I am far more likely to want to revisit. And I guess that's kind of the thing. I was always open that there were surface elements of Smile 1 that just made it the type of horror movie I'm a lot less interested in. And I wouldn't say so much that's the reason I had a more negative view of it. I do always try to separate how I interpret something and my personal enjoyment of it. Except Cars 2, I completely disavow the reassessment of Cars 2 as peak. Like I said earlier, I often enjoy the things I'm also being critical of or interpreting in a critical way. I do not wish to cancel you for liking Willy Wonka or Sky High. Interpretation is not necessarily an attack on the work, but I think this is a reminder that those things can often become muddled. I mean, sometimes there's not really much to the story other than the message. But maybe this is a decent reminder to remain critical not just of media, but of ourselves reading into it. Remembering what we decide a message is can always be influenced by our perspective going in. And also remembering that even a message you agree or disagree with does not equate to how we feel about the story or art as a whole. Media doesn't just exist to be clapped at because we recognize a thing about it that conforms to our worldview. There is, after all, a terrible, terrible result to that. Mr. Bircham.
Hey kids, who wants to learn about preferred pronouns?
No, by the way, I wasn't expecting that to be the conclusion of me revisiting Smile. Thank you for watching. If you liked the video, consider liking or sharing, leaving a comment down below. I have credits scrolling by that you can be a part of if you send a tip over on Patreon. There's also tips on Ko-fi, it's all in the description.